Hello and welcome to SimCast, the Higher Education Simulation Podcast. My name's Tony Jeremy. I'm the Academic Lead for Simulation-Based Education at UEA Norwich.
Hi there everyone, welcome back to SimCast. My name's Lawrence Hill and I chair the school's simulation interest group here at UEA Norwich. And today we're absolutely delighted to be able to bring you a special guest in the form of Joe Ellis-Gage. Joe is a paediatric nurse by background and has spent his clinical career working in a number of settings, but we'll really hand over to Joe to tell us a bit more about himself and a bit more about his clinical background.
Okay, well, thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for coming on.
No worries. So my background, a paediatric nurse, so children and young people's nurse by background. Primarily, I've spent my career working in ED, working as a staff nurse in a general ED, and then moving on to become an emergency nurse practitioner.
Okay.
Within the children and young people's emergency department.
Still getting used to that full
It's a
handle,
mouthful, isn't it?
Yeah, it's hard to say. So both adult EDs and children's EDs primarily. And then I went on to be the department manager of children's emergency department as well. But I've also had a range of other roles. So I've worked as an organ donation specialist nurse for a couple of years, done a couple of different jobs in clinical research and trials, and a safeguarding job as a specialist nurse out in the community.
Okay, great. What got you into higher education then? It sounds like you've got quite a varied career in the clinical context.
Yeah, so I suppose I spent quite a lot of my time teaching within those clinical roles. So both in ED and in organ donation, part of the role was teaching, and I really enjoyed it. I spent a few years out teaching as part of my own business. I had a first aid teaching business, so I enjoyed first aid teaching, but I kind of wanted to be stretched down the sort of more clinical and academic route. So after managing the children's emergency department during COVID, a secondment opportunity came up to come over to the UEA. So I took the secondment, came over for a year, and I've stayed.
And you were telling us you joined UEA in 2021, and I can't believe it. Feels like you're a part of the furniture, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll take that as a compliment.
Oh, most certainly.
100% compliment. So that teaching role that you did in the emergency department, did that have any simulation related kind of, did you use simulation as part of your teaching there?
Yeah, parts of it, yeah. So it was a varied. So sometimes we'd just be teaching on a particular topic or a particular skill, and it would be very functional. And sometimes we would try and pull different bits together and have sort of some level of in-house teaching, a bit like you would on an advanced life support course, but we would do some in-house training. And the feedback from junior staff nurses and from students out on placement was that some level of simulation always helped kind of consolidate all their learning. So whenever we had a quiet spell, if we did, often very early in the morning or late at night, we might run our own little mini simulation for junior staff to kind of try and get involved. And that always went really well.
And did you have any kind of training to do that, or was that just something you kind of learned on the job?
Yeah, it was a learn on the job and probably learn by mistakes and get better as you go.
There must be so many people who do that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely right. If that sounds like how you found yourself getting involved in simulation-based education, please drop us a comment below, because what we're finding is that so many people are kind of meandering into simulation without the opportunity to have like a formal training pathway beforehand.
Yeah, so I'd kind of learn from others and watching, and you go on to more structured courses like the EPALS or an ALS course, and you learn through simulation there, and hopefully you're learning from people that are doing something well. But sometimes you learn from watching some simulation that hasn't worked.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was all kind of on the job practice more than any actual.
No, that's fair enough. And how do you think the experiences that you had working in teaching and learning and education in that clinical context kind of translate into what you do now? Maybe tell us a bit about what your role is here at UEA, and how that relates to simulation. Yeah,
so I'm a lecturer in the children and young people's team, but I primarily teach in skills and simulation. So I'm the module organizer for what we call Nursing Practice and Simulation 3, which is our third year skills and simulation module for BSc nursing. And that's across all fields. So that's adult mental health and children's nurses. And also module organizer for an urgent and emergency care module as well. So a more theory-based module. Now, the practical kind of skills and coming from clinical practice kind of put me in a good position to take on that module. And I've previously done the module organizer role for the first year of that as well. So I'm actually going to be teaching the same students I taught in the first year when they started, in the third year, in this upcoming year.
You've leveled up.
Yeah, I suppose I have. But that's good because what you get is the students want you to have some clinical kind of experience. They want to see some credibility. So I think it's been quite a good sort of starter point for me to go and teach simulation and skills, having just come out of working in an emergency department.
So you said that the nursing practice and simulation module is kind of clinical skills and simulation based, but you also run a theory based module. So where does the nursing practice and simulation fit in the wider nursing curriculum?
Yeah, so we teach nursing practice and simulation across all 3 years of the programme.
Okay.
And the idea behind it is that it gives students the skills and the confidence in some of the more clinical focused work prior to them going out on placement. So in the first year, we teach a big block of skills and simulation prior to their first ever placement, because we've got student nurses coming in who may not have any experience in healthcare at all. So we're going right from the real basics, building their confidence. So when they go out on their first placement, they're in a position to kind of start with some entry-level skills. And then we build on that throughout the 3 years. So we then bring them back after their first placement for a kind of consolidation day where we run a day of simulation of more kind of routine stuff. So we bring them back in and we say, here's a ward full of patients. You've been on your first placement. You had a bit of practice. And we get them to do it in groups because they've all got different experience. So some of them aren't confident doing something by themselves at that point. And we finish year one by sending them back in and they demonstrate back to us what they've done in practice and how they've kind of brought all that knowledge together. We then move into year two and we kind of do a similar approach. Again, year two, we start teaching more complex skills. So we start going into things like respiratory assessment or catheterization. And we do those as a combination of kind of task-based skill teaching and then bringing it all together into some sort of simulation days where they practice a number of skills in one place.
And integrate them.
Yeah, absolutely. So because it's very different, isn't it, from practicing a skill of inserting a cannula or inserting a catheter compared to actually caring for a patient and doing all the other bits at the same time. So yeah, we kind of pull that together. And then the third year, our skills and simulation is a mixture of some clinical skills but also some more kind of communication-based non-clinical skills. So we do things like consent in a simulation form, risk assessments, and then we bring that together in one final day. So the last simulation session that the nursing students do is our major incident day, where we take over the building and create an accident site of some kind. And we get all the students in. Some of them are patients, some of them are staff in various different roles. And we run through a major incident simulation. And in that, they get to pull together all of those skills they've learned over 3 years.
We're actually going to speak to one of your colleagues who has run that day for the past 2 years. And he'll talk to us a little bit more about that in an upcoming episode.
Yeah, looking forward to that one. Jason Corner's coming on the pod in an upcoming episode. I love this idea that you use simulation to do routine activities with relatively junior nursing students. What are the kinds of discussions that you have following those kind of routine simulations? Do learners find it really boring and a little bit kind of not stretching, or actually does that generate some quite good discussion?
I think when we explain what we're doing to them, they sometimes think that sounds boring, because nursing students on the whole like doing the exciting stuff. And they want to be doing the most technical skills all the time. But they also...
I don't think that's just nursing students.
Yeah, healthcare in general, I guess.
I think there's also simulation facilitators.
Yeah,
We're itching to do the complex stuff, aren't we?
And it's the exciting stuff. But then they come back from placement and often the feedback from them, or sometimes the feedback from their supervisors, is they lack some confidence in other areas. And actually, we've realised that just teaching this isolated skills doesn't necessarily work. So when we pitch it to them, we did it this year, and they kind of felt, all right, just do it. We've done that on placement. So, but then after we'd done the day and we did some feedback, they said, this would be great to do more of this, because I really get it now.
Yeah.
And they watch other students. So we had a situation where we gave a patient scenario, and the nurse who was going to look after that patient didn't really know what they were doing. But because they were in a simulated ward, there were other staff. So they turned around, asked one of their colleagues a question, and they went, oh, no, I've seen that on placement.
Right.
And they came in and they kind of took over and started demoing and teaching and learning from each other.
Oh,
Bit of
wow.
experiential learning again.
I mean, I think that's just a ringing endorsement of doing the basics well, isn't it?
Yeah.
But actually, it's still not basic. Running that as an integrated, fully interactive, real-time simulation is still proper sim, and I think that sounds really cool. I think there's probably people listening that would hear that and think, actually, maybe that's something I should try.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be too complex.
No.
So like, and also what we did was we got to save on prep work for us, but also to make it more authentic. We spent the first hour of the day with the students planning their own patients, but they gave the patients to someone else. So this is an example of someone I've cared for on practice. They wrote the patient records up, and then they passed it to the next group. So they watched the group look after that patient. And that way it was good for us because we didn't have to plan a never-ending amount of patients, but also it meant that we didn't overcomplicate things, because often we want to make things more exciting or more complex. And the student nurses actually just used examples from practice, which worked really well.
And felt real.
Yeah.
The Joe, the theory component of the program, how is that delivered in line with the simulation?
Yeah, so the theory runs throughout the 3 years, obviously, as well. And the nursing students are taught in both field-specific groups, so within children's mental health, adults, but also in core lectures where they get taught the core content as a group. So we'll get the whole cohort in having a lecture on whatever it might be that week. So, for instance, consent. And then on a seminar, they'll be in their field-specific groups, and they'll tweak that session to their field. So the mental health might focus more on consent in a patient who doesn't have capacity. The child and group will look at taking consent from someone under the age of 16.
Right.
And then we try to kind of plan that core content to run alongside the simulation, and that's tricky at times because timetabling is our biggest challenge there.
I was just going to say, what are some of your challenges? So when you talk about your cohorts, what's your sort of cohort size, and how does that differ for the different fields?
It could be total up to about 250.
Okay.
Across all four of those fields.
Yeah. And you tend to find we're hitting about 50 for children and young people's, 40 or 50 for mental health, and anywhere from 120 to 150 for adult nursing. So
when you're doing those initial skills and drills, you must still be dealing with relatively large groups.
Yeah, and that poses a challenge, because you've got a couple of challenges. You've got just the vast number of students to get through, and what you don't want to be doing is a production line of a skill. You want to make sure that everyone's getting the most out of it. So we tend to run on groups of about 24. And ideally we'd have smaller groups, but what we do is, because time's not infinite, we try and get the right amount of facilitators to match the group of 24 rather than splitting them into smaller groups.
Okay. So if you're looking at a cohort of 250, that's what, 10 groups?
10 groups.
Yeah. So we teach the same session 10 times. And the other challenge of that is often it's not, although I might be planning a session, I won't deliver all of those myself. Some of them are running at the same time. So we'll have a range of lecturers delivering those sessions. So to get consistency, you've kind of got to do a fair amount of prep and have quite a tight lesson plan to ensure that all the different groups are getting the same content delivered, even if they're getting it delivered by a different person.
And what's been your experience of that then?
Probably a bit of a learning through trial and error.
Okay.
So I think when I had the first year students, I had a really good idea in my mind of how this was all going to work. So, for instance, we run a session where we do their first sort of A, B, C, D, E assessments, and they spend the morning just practicing the functional skills, and then we try and put them into a little mini simulation in the afternoon. And I had two of these sessions running at the same time. I was doing one group, and another lecturer was teaching another group. And as I was full flow midway through doing a simulation, I saw the other group leaving, and I thought,
what's going on here?
They're done quickly. And the way that the other person had delivered the lecture, or the skill session, was very different to the way I'd planned it, and therefore they were done very early. And because it wasn't an experienced lecturer, they didn't feel confident in developing it and sort of trying to find time to make some more learning experience in that last bit of time. They let everyone go.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of thing. And I was like, that's probably my fault. I needed to prep better there. I needed to make sure that person understood the purpose of these sessions. And my instinct is that some of the debrief was lost in that session because the person wasn't confident on debriefing afterwards, and they whizzed through that part of it. So there was some learning there, definitely.
And what preparation do you normally put in place for your faculty members? Do you hold a faculty briefing? Are people involved in the design of the kind of the sessions? How does it normally work for you guys?
So we have the module organizer who kind of takes the lead, but they'll have a field lead. So all the different fields of nursing are represented within the team.
Right.
And therefore, whatever session we do will have input from all those fields.
And they can kind of put a twist and specialise it.
Yeah, and sometimes it's that we're doing a subject where actually the mental health field lead really needs to give some input across all of the other sessions. And sometimes it's that we tweak it. So we'll say, well, actually for child field, these will be the seminars, the scenarios. Mental health, it'll be these, and adult, it'll be these. And we can then tweak that and adapt it. And then with the wider teaching team, what we tend to do is we get our lesson plans written up, our scenarios all prepared in advance, and we store them in a central place so everyone can access them and read them in advance if they want to, because certain people like to have more prep time than others. And then we run a pre-session meeting for each of our sessions. So if we're teaching recognition of the unwell patient or anaphylaxis, a few weeks before, we'll have a Teams meeting and invite everyone to come along.
Okay, so you do a briefing, but well in advance of the actual event.
Yeah, and then they get to have a kind of a read through, a look through of the lesson plan, troubleshoot, ask any questions, clarify if something's not quite clear.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm sure there must be people listening to this that are having to wrestle similar challenges. If that is the case and you are experiencing similar challenges to Joe, please drop us a like for this podcast, and also be really nice if you could hit the subscribe button and check the notification bell so that you can keep up to date with all of our other conversations that we're having with similar academics. If I may take us back a second, you said that you used to lead for the year one simulations and now you lead for the third year nursing. What differences do you notice in those two learner groups in the ways that they engage with simulation?
I think the first years are kind of often very keen, but they don't know what they're getting themselves into. So they come in possibly with a slightly skewed view of what they're going to be doing. And they come in expecting probably just a lot of clinical activity constantly, not realizing that actually, we can't teach you to do X before we've given you the theory for it. And they don't understand necessarily that process. So that's something that we have to kind of embed in them so they understand how it works. The third years tend to understand that a bit more. They've been through a couple of years of it. They understand the structure. They understand that they've got to think about the pre sort of theory first. They also know that if we say there's something that they might need to read in advance, it's probably going to be useful. I'm not saying that they all do it,
No,
but you get a bigger show of hands of people who's
sure.
checked the pre-reading first, so that helps.
Yeah, sure. And what about how they interact with facilitators during debrief? Do you notice any differences or similarities in the way that first and third year simulation learners interact on your program?
First years tend to be pretty hesitant. They're often the most anxious because it's all new to them.
Yeah.
But I think they struggle to get as much out of that debrief because they don't want to be putting their hand up to say they don't understand something, or that they felt uncomfortable with something, or even that they made a mistake. And they're also not great at critically kind of appraising their friends.
Yeah, and peers.
Just
give
it was good.
Fluffy feedback.
It was good.
Yeah,
It's what you get a lot, isn't it?
And we one of our sessions we watch remotely. So rather than having the whole group standing around a student watching, we send a small group in and we watch remotely on cameras in a different room. And the first time I did that, we said, right, let's give some feedback when they come back in. And it was just a room of people nodding their head and saying, very good. And then afterwards, I provided like a little sheet, a little prompt sheet, which guided them into giving slightly more critical feedback.
Great.
Whereas the third years are very comfortable at giving critical feedback to each other.
I guess they've had a little bit of time to get to know each other, get to know what simulation is all about. I think one of the issues, again, is in healthcare, we naturally attract these practical hands-on learners and they think that's the best way of learning, but simulation is a completely different beast altogether, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, quick question to you, Joe. How do you introduce the concept of simulation to your first year learners?
So we we start with trying to distinguish a little bit between what simulation is and what teaching of a skill is, because it's kind of blurred, isn't it, at times? And we try and explain that process of, we can't teach you a full-blown simulation until we've taught you some individual skills first, and how we start to sort of put it together. And I guess it's a sort of slowly kind of throughout the year approach as to how they learn about simulation. We've done demos online. So one of the first sessions the students get in the first year is almost a live simulation that they watch online. So we want to teach them core basics around something like basic life support to a group of 250 students.
Yeah, challenge.
It's tricky. You've got break them into small groups and teach the same thing, same theory, same demo over and over again. You've got to stand in front of the group at the front of a lecture theatre, and other than the front row, no one can see you. So we trialled one where we did that online, and we streamed it with cameras from the simulation room, and they got to kind of watch us, ask questions on the chat. It's recorded, so they can go back and pre-watch it before re-watch it before they come back in for their session, and that really helped with them seeing what simulation meant. So we gave each other, me and a colleague gave each other a scenario and said, "Oh, I'll read it out," and they go and practice it, and then that kind of made it slightly less intimidating for them.
Sure.
We included our mistakes in our scenario, so
brilliant.
If one of us missed something, sometimes the students will spot that, and they'll say, did you check this when you were on respiratory?
That's so good in terms of that shared vulnerability. Yeah, showing that actually, to err is human, and that actually, your lecturers are not superhuman, healthcare providers. They are normal people like everyone watching and learning.
Yeah, absolutely. That balance between being clinically credible but also human, that kind of worked.
Yeah,
and I think they realised that if we made a mistake,
it's okay for them to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, and one of the other things we've done, which I think has helped with the kind of interactive part of simulation, is for the third years, we used to teach them all within their fields for skills. So adult, children and young people, mental health. For the third years, we now mix them.
Okay.
So students were apprehensive of that at the start of this last year, felt like they weren't going to get as good a value if they were in a group that was mixed. And then very quickly they all came around to it.
Brilliant.
Some of the skills bits we wanted to separate off.
Yeah.
So, for instance, learning to insert a cannula for the child field is very different. And inserting it into a smaller child's arm and a baby, positioning and all that kind of stuff. So we did separate them off for certain elements to do field specific work. But when we brought the simulation bit together, it was great having different fields.
I absolutely love that. Simulation as kind of meaningful, interdisciplinary, interprofessional working. I think, if we can show learners in simulation how this can work together as a team, I think that hopefully will translate out into practice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. That's really cool.
Do the nurses do anything with any other healthcare professionals?
Yeah, they do. They do a thing called interprofessional learning,
okay,
which is where we pull together different health professionals into some short sessions just to start the ball rolling in the first year with looking at how different services and different teams sort of integrate. What would be great probably as part of our development is to do that a little bit more within simulation throughout the program. The challenge is that the nursing numbers are so high compared to the other groups.
But then you throw other healthcare professionals and you've got more numbers, haven't you? So
so that balance is tricky, but they get a little bit of it. And then the bulk of that interprofessional stuff happens when they're out on practice, because the nursing students spent 50% of their time is out on practice. So that's where they get that.
Just going back to what you were saying about the differences between first and third year learners, and those first year learners being much more apprehensive and nervous. And I think that's probably something that I certainly recognise in paramedic students, and I'm sure that's something we see in all healthcare students in simulation training. And we've talked about, the myth of psychological safety really in simulation. But I guess I wonder if there's anything that you do to, over the course of that first year, to try and bed the students into feeling more comfortable in simulation. What are the tricks and the best tips that you would give somebody who's trying to engender that feeling of security in simulation?
I suppose don't go in too deep too quickly. So let them build some general confidence in whatever topic you're focusing on before you throw in a sort of simulation scenario, because otherwise they get overwhelmed. Not to make the simulations too complex or go on for too long. Sometimes there's that pressure of filling a morning session with simulation, whereas actually you might benefit more from a 30, 45-minute simulation and some really good debrief time. And the other thing is getting them to understand about how much they learn from observing as opposed to participating. Because often I think students think, if I'm not doing something, I'm not learning. So what we do is we get them to watch each other, to give feedback. And once they watch each other, they become more comfortable with that process, because they realise that no one's laughing, no one's being unkind, and they're learning from watching. Although one of the challenges with that, we try and use the technology. So we do some little group work stuff where there might be 5 or 6 around a bed and they'll take turns doing something and feedback to each other. But when we try and get into some real simulation scenarios, this is something we do in the first year, we put maybe 3 or 4 students into a room, we give them a scenario, we have a lecturer there who kind of guides them through, and the rest of the team watch from a different room and provide that feedback, which we thought would be great because it means you haven't got lots of people peering over your shoulder in a room with 20 people stood there. And most people have got on with it fine. And some students are very reluctant to go into that room that's got a camera show, rolling.
Oh, right.
And that was probably a challenge we hadn't quite anticipated. And I think it's not that they won't do it, it's that they probably need a bit more prep. So we're looking at doing some completely non-clinical activity with the cameras first.
Okay.
So they just get comfortable
used.
being on camera.
Almost like part task training. Like getting used to the...
Well, it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? If you're doing simulation, not only are you're clinically vulnerable, but then if you don't want to be on a camera as well, that just compounds it even further. So getting people comfortable with that before we then make them clinically vulnerable, or from their point of view anyway, in terms of simulation.
Hopefully that'll make a difference. We're going to trial some activity which we haven't got planned yet, but we're going to trial that this year and see if it can make people a bit more comfortable with that.
That sounds amazing, and we'd love it if you come back and talk to us about that at some point in the future. That'd be really cool.
So Joe, your curriculum has had simulation embedded in it from the design. Have you had any challenges in terms of making that into a reality? The curriculum as designed and the curriculum as actually delivered.
Yeah.
Are there any challenges, particularly with simulation?
So I think we've had a couple of fairly significant challenges. We haven't seen quite the whole 3 years of this through without being impacted by COVID yet.
Right, okay.
So the current third years who are finishing started in September 2020 and were significantly impacted by COVID restrictions in how we delivered
placements were delayed, weren't they? And
absolutely. So they lost some of that consolidation. Skills were limited numbers in rooms and all of that kind of thing. So we haven't quite implemented it all the way through yet, although I'm hoping with our students who are going into the third year in September, they'll be the first ones who've really had the curriculum as we intended it all the way through. But there are also some what seem like boring practicalities that make this harder. Things around
we're all for talking about boring practicalities, by the way. I think because that's the reality for higher education, healthcare educators. Those boring practicalities are very real. Yeah,
I mean, so if we take an example, the way that ideally the curriculum would run is we'd say second years you are learning about the respiratory system. So you're going to have a lecture on A&P and look at the lungs. You're going to have a seminar that looks at field-specific conditions, and so COPD for the adults and acute wheeze and asthma for the child field, etc. And then you'll come into a simulation session where you'll practice your respiratory assessment and you'll be auscultating and palpating and all of this. The challenge is that with 250 students, we can't get them all in on the Friday at the end of the respiratory week to come and practice that.
So some groups might be weeks and weeks away from when the theory's been delivered. I guess.
Absolutely. So it then doesn't, or sometimes, one of the challenges, sometimes you have to teach it the practical, the skills part, and they've not had the AMP session yet.
Right, okay.
Which is a real challenge.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a pain. Yeah. So there's this risk of like discontinuity basically between, you know, getting that theory, part, task, simulation kind of all lined up and nice and neat.
Yeah, and the challenge is what you don't want to be doing is putting off all the simulation to the end of the year when you know the core content's been taught, because then they lose the benefit of using it in practice after being practicing in simulation. So that's a real challenge. We did the same with our first years, where we do this demo sim online for the ABCDE assessment, and then we realised the first time we ran it that I think one group had their practical session 5 weeks after we'd taught the theory session. Another one had it 2 days after we'd taught the theory session. Right. And there was a disparity in how we did that.
You're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place when you've got a group that size.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any obvious solution. If anyone's got one at home, please let us know in the comments below.
I think the way we had to approach it was we are where we are for the year that we've got it planned, and we still are in that situation now where it's not perfect. But making the most of the first 15 minutes of a simulation skills session to really establish where that group of students are in a sort of pre-brief, get that core understanding sorted, that helps. Okay. Because sometimes you do that and you go, great, they remember it, the delivery of the theory wasn't very long ago, we can go straight into this. And sometimes you get a group and you go, okay, we're going to spend the next little bit longer re-going over those basics. And that's important. And again, that goes back to the challenges of different facilitators.
We've kind of talked about this before. That's essentially an unintended learning outcome, isn't it? Yep. You know, you just have to go off track a little bit. What your original plan was, because the group of learners you got in front of you, they need a different kind of attention.
And it's perfectly reasonable for that to be the case, because it's natural, isn't it, for that theory knowledge to have faded over the last 5 weeks, if that's the case. And actually, we as simulation educators need to meet the learner where they are and make sure the learning's fit for them. Yeah,
absolutely. And sometimes they've got different experience from practice. They'll come back from a practice placement and you'll think, great, let's go and teach them this now. And they may actually have had a completely different experience than you expected, different patients in different experiences, and they haven't consolidated something that you've previously taught them. But they may have jumped ahead and learned something that you haven't thought about teaching them yet.
And so many different practice experiences with a group, again, that large.
Yeah. And then, of course, the other challenge of practice is trying to get the students to ensure that they are practicing safely and correctly, and not necessarily always as they've seen in practice. And you do get a disparity between what we're teaching them based on current guidance and clinical guidelines, and sometimes what they see in practice, because it's this is what we've got to do here to get through the shift.
I mean, simulation's really useful, isn't it, for having those real kind of conversations about the theory practice gap and, you know, work as imagined and work as done, and closing that and saying, you know, I'm not saying that this person's wrong for doing that, but what are the reasons why they're doing it? And it opens those conversations.
We've talked again previously about the importance of using lived experiences as part of a debrief conversation. You know, even if it's just a segue to what you're talking about.
And sometimes the simulation's just the vehicle, isn't it, to unlocking that conversation about that thing that happened in practice and that everyone then learns from.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got to be flexible with that in how you're delivering. So, as an example, we taught a very simple session about an introduction to nasogastric tubes to our children's students, because they see a lot of that on their first placement. And one of the group, 1 year when we taught it, was a healthcare assistant. And they kind of put their hand up halfway through and went, that's not how we do it where I work. And we had to then have that conversation around, actually, in that situation, they worked in a slightly specialist area, and what their way of working was correct for that area.
Right.
And that was great, because we managed to break that down and work it out in that session. But again, it's one of the challenges of the various facilitators teaching across a big curriculum, is that everyone needs to have the confidence and knowledge to do that.
But you know what as well, this is partly where there is so much value in simulating routine practice, because it's probably in there's the sort of the widest variation on what good looks like. So, and also by simulating routine practice as you do, which I think is marvelous, it's so much more inclusive of the rest of the learners, because you can pretty much guarantee that if you're doing something routine, that most people have seen it happen. So everyone feels included, everyone feels they can contribute to that debrief, and it makes that simulation so much richer if everyone feels they've got a bit to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just some intimidating new thing every time you do simulation.
Yeah. So huge credit for that. I think that's marvellous.
I mean, it's been amazing talking to you, Joe, but we're almost at time. So one last question before you leave. What piece of advice would you give to someone who might be in a similar situation to you? Maybe they've got a simulation module that they're running as part of a larger program with other things involved. What's been your kind of key learning since you've been here?
I guess probably two things. One is be really open to learning from your mistakes and doing something and then going, well, that didn't work.
Yeah.
The students learned something, but not what I was intending. And I'm going to tweak that for the next session and putting your hands up. I think that's really important. But also running by your colleagues, you've got a whole wealth generally of experience in a team. And it's very easy to kind of box yourself in and think, this is my responsibility. I'm going to get this planned. I'm going to get this sorted, which puts you under a lot of pressure. But sometimes handing over your lesson plan to someone else and saying, does that make sense? Would you add anything? Really helps. And I've done that before where a colleague's given me one and I've gone, I don't understand what this means. Or that's a lot to fit in an hour and a half. Why don't we pull that bit out?
Yeah.
And people have done the same to me, and I think that's really important. Doesn't take much, doesn't take a lot of their day up, but just that bit of almost proofread this for me. Does this work?
So some humility and some shared reassurance.
Yeah.
Exactly what I was thinking, yeah.
Yeah, and then I suppose if you're going to have a third one is the same from students. Be open to listening to their feedback, either live when they're saying, I don't get this, and you need to completely change your plan at that point, or after a session when they go, that was great, but we could have done this more, and thinking about that for the future, because that's the way we're teaching. So the students are kind of the point of it all.
Yeah,
absolutely. Oh, that is just a perfect place to bring this to a close. So, Joe, thank you so much for your time and joining us on this podcast. It's been lovely talking to you about your experiences. And so, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much, Joe.
No worries.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, everyone, for watching. We hope you enjoyed the session. Please remember to give us a like and hit the subscribe button. And don't forget to check that notification bell. We'll see you in the next one.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.